Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to the discussion, ANZACS and the Militarization of Australian Society. Our second speaker is Bassil, who I'm sure many of you understand. He lectures in politics at the International Relations at Macquarie University, where he holds a position for the Center for Middle East and North African Studies. His interests include global political economy, colonialism and post-colonialism, and the political economy of uneven North-South relations.
I'm going to start with a little bit of music. I hope no one minds, and I hope this works. But I think you'll see, hopefully you'll listen to the relevance of it. Sorry.
Sounds like Bassil.
Well, I think you get the idea. Not really. Okay, well that's Edwin Starr's War. What is it really good for? Absolutely nothing. Now I think, I would agree with Starr, and many of you would as well, but in fact, I guess in many ways, the point I want to make is that war is actually for a particular group. Those in power, some of those who constitute the dominant elite. War is good for a number of things, and that's, I guess, the basis of what I'm going to present. Before I go into that, I just want to say a few words on militarisation as well. And I think partly one of the reasons why I feel so strongly about this issue is that I grew up in the 80s in a time, I think, when we still remembered the horrors of the Vietnam War and the opposition towards it, and that there was a real sense, and this was the period of the Second Cold War and of the potential for a nuclear Holocaust or war, and there was a real sort of sense of antagonism towards war. And Anzac Day, and my recollection of it back then, was that it was very much about remembering the horror of war, the cost of war, and the way that it impacts on society. So I think my earliest recollections of Anzac Day and the meaning of Anzac, it was that it was a reminder that we should not go to war quickly or with any speed or forgetfulness of the horror of it. I don't think it has that meaning today, and I guess that's really why and that's, I guess, where I think the militarisation of ANZAC has actually played such an important part. I'm actually going to quote from Mark McKenna as well, because I think he makes the point that ANZAC is part of a broader militarisation, and he describes it as the surfeit of jingoistic military histories, the increasing tendency for military displays before football grand finals, the extension of the term ANZAC to encompass firefighters and sporting champions, the professionally stage-managed event of the Dawn Services ANZAC Code, the burgeoning popularity of battlefield tourism, and so on. And I think we've all witnessed that over at least 20 or 25 years. And of course he problematises aspects of that, as do other scholars who work in the field that I've read in recent weeks. Now the question, I guess, and this is where I want to build, on what David spoke about, is that yes, there's been a militarisation of bellicosity, of belligerence that has emerged, and the waxing and waning of ANZAC over a century has also, I think, in more recent years led, or not only has it waxed, but it's also changed in meaning to some extent. And I guess what I want to do is explain to some extent why that has happened. I, like David, don't think that people are just sponges of information. They do tend to sift through, and that I don't want to see Australians as suckers ready to fill their minds with just whatever propaganda is put out there. But over a sustained period of time, a certain cultural understanding or a certain set of ideas becomes dominant. And I think over 20 or 25 years, this militarisation discourse or idea has certainly pervaded our society. Now, cultural critic David Mackay has argued, and many other scholars, this is an area I've worked in for a number of years, has sort of found, I think, or explained that over the last 30 or so years, through processes of what we call globalisation, of course that's a very complex idea, certain fragmentation, the change in the way that capitalism has reshaped national and local communities, that people have sought new ways to identify and to fill a vacuum that's been created by those quite complex and often contradictory processes. The question is, and this is what Davidson argues, or Davidson tries to answer, is why has this concept of the militarised ANZAC or myth or Australian understanding of ANZAC filled that vacuum? Why not some other story about ANZAC, about our background, our constituting myths and so forth? And the way I want to answer that is to actually go back to Edwin Starr and say that, and my initial point, that this sort of militarisation actually does serve some purposes, and those purposes I think can be grouped into two broad ones. And the first is that it legitimates government policies that might be indefensible in other circumstances. So that actually has a particular purpose for governments who have largely lost legitimacy due to a whole range of causes, those associated with the shift from national economic and social planning to ones determined by the market, and also that often governments and both major parties in Australia, I think, have largely become protectors or assistants for the accumulation of wealth and the way that global capital can sort of increase its capacity to interfere with what had largely been, or what had previously been, the public sphere. And really I'm talking about privatisation and the different processes that are associated with that. And that feeds into the second reason or purpose that this militarisation serves, and that's just another strategy of capitalist accumulation. And I'll talk about that in terms of Australia as a purchaser of weapons and also a participant in global war. So it's this idea that ANZAC Day is part of this culture war and a way of shaping Australia in a particular way that provides both governments and owners of capital capacity to manipulate in policy in particular ways. Now, Henry, I'm going to just quickly talk about that first of the two major reasons or motivations. And here I take some ideas from Henry Reynolds, who has written extensively and was one of the co-authors of the book that David mentioned earlier, What's Wrong with ANZACS. But he's also written elsewhere about ANZACS and is a well-known Australian historian besides that work. And he says that militarising a society makes it easier for governments to commit Australia to wars such as those in the Middle East. We can and that's part of his major argument. He talks about how this allows for a particular shaping of our society towards belligerency and bellicosity as well. And I guess one of the examples I want to draw on is just a very recent one, and that is the contrast in the way that the Abbott government, so promptly and eagerly, I would say, enthusiastically joined the war on terror against the Islamic State, and contrast that with the huge resistance and the unwillingness to participate in the humanitarian effort in West Africa when the Ebola crisis emerged. And that for me was a real moment to signal that that the militarisation had provided a particular framework in which government acted now or behaved in a particular way. Now, of course, the government came under a fair bit of criticism for that, those contrasting decisions. But nonetheless, the expenditure on the war in ISIS far exceeds that which was belatedly and very unhappily spent by the Abbott government in helping the victims and to prevent the spread of Ebola in West Africa and globally. So again, that I think is an important aspect of this notion of militarisation. The other example, there are two other examples I want to draw on to sort of show how this militarisation provides government with governments of both of the major parties, predominantly, who have been largely in lockstep on foreign intervention and war for a long time. In fact, Bob Hawke was one of the most vocal supporters of Australia's involvement in Iraq in 1991. In fact, of all world leaders, he's often quoted in a number of places for his enthusiasm for that campaign. This militarisation and this sort of, I think, also sanctification of the military has been is also obvious in a number of examples, and the one I guess I want to draw on is the example of the way that the government and the public and media reacted to the ABC's attempt to reveal accusations made by some refugees that they had been abused by naval officers back in 2014. So rather than that story provide grounds for an investigation of the claims, the widespread, as I've said, sanctification of our armed forces resulting from this broader militarisation and glorification of Australian involvement overseas meant that no scrutiny of such claims was possible. So that story not only led to huge criticism of the ABC, and some would say started the government or gave the government the ammunition it needed to decrease funding of the ABC, despite the promise of Abbott on the eve of the election that he would do no such thing, and led to an increased conservative whipping up of antagonism towards the ABC. Now that was opportunism, absolutely, but within the context of this sort of broader militarisation and sanctification of the military. And of course we have to take that case in context of how asylum seekers or refugees are seen in Australia as well, and I'll come back to that in a few moments. Well, actually, no, I'll come back to it now, because I guess one of the other areas where we've seen this militarisation of Australian society and language and government policy most obviously is in the area of refugees and what the campaign or the so-called policy of of Operation Sovereign Borders, which was launched by the Abbott government to 2013. And here's an example, I think, a real example of how militarisation is being employed by policymakers to draw the wider public into accepting very draconian, illegal and expensive policies. And I'll talk about how much the refugee policy costs Australia in a moment. And so I think that aspect of this militarisation of Australian society needs to be taken into account. It's an important aspect of it because governments have, and I think David made some comments around this as well, have certainly played into this, or played up the sort of glorification of Anzac Day and our military involvement overseas in more recent times. As I said, I think a way that's different from, somewhat different from earlier periods. Now, I want to move into the second reason that I put up earlier, or the second benefit that I said that war had, or militarisation had, and that is the economic one. This idea, or this, I guess not idea, but this capacity for governments to do two things. One, to further develop their policies around privatisation and user pay, and also the way that the governments use military spending as a form of transferring public money to private companies. And I think that's largely been overlooked in much of the debate around this. According to a report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute on the global trade in arms from earlier this year, America's main client in purchasing arms now is South Korea. But what shocked me was that they said that after South Korea, America's two largest clients were UAE and Australia. And not only are we now one of the main clients of the US so-called military-industrial complex, according to a Guardian article, we are now the 6th largest importer of arms anywhere in the world. Yep. Now this is at a time when we're constantly being told how precarious the national budget is and how crucial savings in health and education, in welfare and other areas are for ensuring the long-term viability of the Australian economy. In other words, we are being told at this time of huge increase in expense in military spending that a $6 co-payment will solve the budget crisis. Ben Eltham, in an article he wrote in New Matilda, cited a report by Mark Thompson from the Australian Strategic Policy Network, who's done some projections on military spending. And firstly, he says that 2014-15, the government will spend $29 billion on the military, and is one of the country's largest fiscal outlays, well ahead of so-called big ticket items such as higher education or family tax benefits. According to Thompson, his projections for military spending are that Australia will be spending $50 billion a year on defence, so-called defence, by 2023-24, so within a decade. Now compare this to the $9,223 million spent of government funding to tertiary education, which of course has been hit again and is likely to be further decreased in the upcoming budget in a couple of months' time, or the total outlay of federal spending on health, which is $50 billion, of which Australians contribute a component through the Medicare levy as well. Now, if we consider Operation Sovereign Borders a component of the this sort of military spending, in Australia, then we add another large slice of $3 billion of public money finding its way into the hands of private contractors. Now, you know, as well as this transfer of money, the discourse and the language around asylum seekers and offshore detention has seen a rise in Australian xenophobia and racism, maybe not a rise, but at least a buying into further ideas of xenophobia and racism. And there is some evidence that, and certainly in the US there's stronger evidence, and I wasn't able to find direct links here, but there are certainly in the US and the UK direct links between funding of think tanks and other organisations that create further fear of immigration and border control by the very companies that are involved in detention and protection of the borders. Now, I'm not saying that's happening here, but those same companies are doing those things overseas. Every possibility that something like that may be happening here as well. Now, the way that societies are, and so there is this aspect of the way that our money is being spent, and when I say our, but us as a community is being spent, and how willing Australians are to allow that to happen without any questioning of it, because of a long period, I think, of this notion of militarisation and Australia's sort of identity being bound up with the ANZAC myth and the belief that Australia was born on those battlefields, or the Australian identity was born on those battlefields. The way that societies are shaped by militarisation and the involvement of capitalist organisations is nothing new. In fact, US President Dwight Eisenhower, in his farewell address, and we all remember Dwight Eisenhower being a member of the US military establishment before he became president, urged his compatriots to be vigilant to the power of what he called the military-industrial complex, and this is back in 1960. And just to quote from him, he says, "The conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications." And he goes on to say, "We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes." He was very concerned about the influence that the militarisation of society had on the very basic democratic values of America. Now, whatever we think of those, for someone like Dwight Eisenhower to urge vigilance against it says that it must actually have some deep negative impact on any society. Despite the struggles of the 1960s and 70s by many in the US against war and militarisation, and we all know the stories of the anti-war movement in that period, today, 55 years on, I think it's fair to say, Americans are more beholden to the military-industrial complex than they were back in 1960. And in fact, a study by American sociologist recently passed away, Chalmers Johnson, who's probably best known for his book Blowback, which in the 1990s argued that US foreign policy it sort of excesses of US foreign policy and adventurism might lead to some blowback on America. And after 9/11, of course, many people saw that event as a prediction of what Chalmers warned against. But he, a few years ago, studied quite closely the change in the US economy in the last sort of 20 or 30 years. And he came to the conclusion that somewhere between 60 and 70% of all US manufacturing was now related to the military-industrial complex. That is, at least three out of five people working in the US worked in some capacity around the military-industrial complex. In manufacturing. Now that's a huge component of any society, and it clearly has had an impact on the way that Americans see themselves and the way that they see their sort of military, their culture bound in this sense of militarism. I would say in the US, there's a certain aggressive militarism which has taken hold, and I have to say some of the stories I read about responses to the movie American Sniper in American movie cinemas, where people got up and cheered when the sniper killed a sort of terrorist or an Arab, were just shocking, but in some ways not surprising. When you think of the sort of wider polarisation of the US in recent years, that aggressive militarism has taken hold of a significant proportion of the population. The social implications are shocking and evident in increased inequalities, huge government debt, vigilantism, and increasing levels of police and law enforcement brutality visited on minorities. And I don't know if anyone's seen the most recent footage of a police officer shooting someone that a black American who they were apprehending for I think a traffic offence. Broken tail light, just to get an extent of the extent that that this sort of bellicosity and violence is pervading US society. Now, I might be overstating that, but certainly the stuff I've been reading in more recent times suggests that it's certainly an issue that Americans would want to address very quickly. We here in Australia must also be vigilant against this militarisation and the sort of militarisation of our culture and our identity. And the recasting of the ANZACS story is but one, albeit symbolic, dimension of that, sort of changing attitude of Australians to ourselves and the world. We've got to be vigilant, I believe, that we're not led down the same path taken by the US. In reality, must be vigilant not to become more Americanised, trying to fulfil the Conservatives' ambition of being what they deem to be Australian. So to come back to Edmund Starr and to answer his question of what war is good for, I would agree with him, absolutely nothing.
Thank you.